Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. I'm Eddie Conway, coming to you from Baltimore. The case of Mumia Abu-Jamal has recently been in the headlines across the world. Joining me to bring some clarity to Mumia's case is Rachel Wolkenstein.
Thank you very much for having me, Eddie. Really appreciate it.
Can you explain what this new ruling by Judge Tucker means for Mumia?
Yes, I can. First of all, I want to say this is a tremendous win for Mumia. It's the first time since he was arrested in December 1981 that there's been a positive decision for him by any Pennsylvania state court judge. So this is huge. Now, what Judge Tucker granted is also extremely significant. What he did is he vacated all the appeal denials that Mumia had from his post-conviction proceedings beginning in 1998 through 2012. And Mumia has a right now to reappeal all of those post-conviction proceedings. And this is the whole scope of issues in Mumia's case, from, of course, his innocence and the prosecutorial and police misconduct that occurred and was intrinsic to his conviction and death sentence. It also is the questions of jury selection, the exclusion of African Americans from the jury, his right of self-representation, his right to effective assistance of counsel, and just about every single legal issue that exists in a criminal trial. So all of those issues, most of them would grant him, would give him a new trial, will be on appeal again. In my opinion, based upon the entirety of the case, the evidence of Mumia's innocence, and the violations of state misconduct, that actually the charges should be dismissed at the end of such a hearing if there was any justice in the appeal court.
Mm-hmm. Well, what was the basis for Judge Tucker's decision? I understand there was a Williams case up there that,
correct.
That's related to Mumia. Explain that,
well, the Williams case is Williams versus Pennsylvania, and it was decided in June of 2016. It itself is a precedent-setting United States Supreme Court decision, not a Pennsylvania state court decision. And in that decision, it was Justice Castile, a Pennsylvania Supreme Court justice, who was the subject of the court's ruling. And what the Supreme Court found is that Justice Castile should have recused himself during the hearings and the appeals, rather, of Terrence Williams, because Castile had been the district attorney who authorized the prosecutors to seek the death sentence against Terry Williams. And the fact that Castile did not do so was considered to be a fundamental violation of due process, the right to an impartial appeals hearing, and the appearance of bias, and in fact the bias. And the court set out a new standard for determining on an objective basis when a judge has committed this type of misconduct. And that issue, that basically new fact period, the new law, was used as the basis for Mumia's attorneys to file a post-conviction proceeding, Mumia's fourth, in the Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas with Judge Tucker presiding. So that was the legal basis of the whole proceeding. This has been litigated for 2.5 years. The district attorney's office was required to produce any sort of documents that they had that indicated Castile's involvement in Mumia's case. Mumia's was on appeal, direct appeal, when Castile was the district attorney. But in that role as the district attorney, Ronald Castile was responsible for arguing on behalf of the prosecution that all of the due process violations in Mumia's trial should be upheld. And the central issue in that case, in Mumia's direct appeal, was the exclusion of African Americans from the jury. And we could go on and on, but that was his responsibility. So
did he actually argue the case, or did one of his prosecutors argue the case? There's some question about who was actually there representing the state.
Well, that isn't really the issue in an appeals situation or in this prosecutor thing, because what we're talking about is actually Castile was the district attorney. He was the elected district attorney. His job was never to be the person who actually argued the appeals in the Pennsylvania Supreme Court or in the United States Supreme Court when Mumia filed for review after being denied by the Supreme Court in '89. So the issue technically was one of whether or not there was, quote, proof evidence that Castile was personally involved in Mumia's case. And the point about this is that, in fact, evidence did come out about this, new evidence, which was to try and keep this brief, is that Castile, evidence came out that Castile had a whole policy of expediting death sentences, the signing of death warrants against people who were sentenced to death. And at that time, the total responsibility for the signing of execution warrants was in the hands of the governor. The governor at that time was a man named Robert Casey, and he was opposed to capital punishment. So he was not anxious to sign death warrants. Castile and some other legislators were very anxious to push Casey to sign warrants, and Castile wrote a letter, personal letter, as the district attorney, to then Governor Casey and said, I urge you to expedite the signing of death warrants, and in particular, you must do this in cases where people are convicted as police killers, to send a message that we really mean to execute people. The key phrase about pushing for sending the message for police killers was not part of the original draft by Castile's assistant, but he had written that in himself and made that a specific thing. Now, D.A. Krasner's office, which is a whole other issue, I can come back to that in a second, I would like to, they maintained and still maintain that that is not specific enough, despite the fact there were only 3 men on death row at the time that Castile wrote this letter, and despite the fact that Mumia's name was not specifically mentioned in the letter, because Mumia was still on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, so technically there could be no warrant of execution signed against him until that was completed. Krasner's position, which actually was adopted by Judge Tucker, is that that wasn't specific enough to prove that Castile was involved. Now, I want to make another point which goes to the actual ruling that Tucker had in favor of Mumia and granting him new appeal rights. The point about this is that Castile, when he ran, both as DA and when he ran to be elected as a Supreme Court justice, bragged about the fact that he had put 45 men on death row. He bragged that he was a law and order candidate. He bragged that he had the support of the Fraternal Order of Police and he had been granted an award by them. And all of that was in the public domain. He also publicly defended prosecutors who were found to be involved in various acts of misconduct by the superior courts in Pennsylvania, and he castigated attorneys who, were pushing Brady issues, police and prosecutorial misconduct issues in a way that he thought they shouldn't. So this was the public persona of Castile and Justice Castile. And Judge Tucker, when he made his ruling, while he didn't find there was this specific involvement, he did say that actually Castile should have recused himself because everything that he said and did created the appearance of impropriety and the appearance of bias, and that the judicial tribunal, whether it's the trial court or the appeals court, is supposed to be neutral and impartial.